Buenos dias. Good, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you this morning. I'm going to speak to you about big data and the opportunity that we at the United Nations believe big data represents for global efforts to achieve sustainable development and improve humanitarian action. This is an ideal forum in which to be talking about this topic. This is a quotation often ascribed to Aristotle, we are what we habitually do. It is incredibly important today to be bringing the knowledge of the social sciences into policy development and implementation because it is possible to see human behavior in a way that was never possible before, and to understand how to use an awareness of what people say and what people do to understand whether our policies and programs are working. Big data has an important role to play in that process. So very quickly, for those who don't know, Global Pulse is an initiative of the United Nations Secretary General. Was established in 2009 as an effort to understand how to use all of this new information to improve how we operate. Our vision is a world in which big data is used safely and responsibly for the public good, and our role is to serve as an accelerator of transformation of public sector toward a more efficient and effective way of operating. We have 3 labs, data science innovation labs, our headquarters in New York, a lab in Kampala, Uganda, and a lab in Jakarta, Indonesia. We do not yet have a presence in Latin America or the Caribbean, and that's part of why I'm here today. This is something that we are now looking at very seriously. At Global Pulse, we play essentially 3 roles. One is that of innovation lab. So here we're talking about working with partners in public sector, United Nations agencies, national institutions, together with government and together with academia, private sector, to understand how we can solve problems with data. We're doing experiments. We're building software within our labs to develop these solutions. We also serve as a data policy think tank. So here we're talking about understanding how to make this safe. Right? What are the standards that need to be in place around anonymization, for example, which is very important and very difficult with big data. And finally, we do a lot of public engagement to help ordinary people around the world understand that they are producing data that could be used to improve public policy, but today still often is not used. And we engage with private sector to help them understand the role that their data can play in bringing us to a better world. So you can see these are the pictures of our labs in Uganda, Indonesia, New York. These are safe spaces for exploring and experimenting and learning through trial and error what works and what doesn't. So in 2013, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon commissioned a report on what was called the data revolution. Some calling for a data revolution, others saying, no, actually a data revolution is already happening in the world. But we need to make sure that it's directed toward the public good and that the risks are mitigated. One of the challenges that we have is that the world has changed and much of the data that we need is now not in one place. You will remember the Millennium Development Goals launched in the year 2000. In those days, the data needed to achieve those goals was collected by government, owned by government, and used by government, and it was statistics and surveys. Now, fast forward to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are more goals, this is more complex, but most of the data needed to achieve them is produced by people in real time, often without their knowing it. It's collected by machines, and it's owned by private sector. And yet the insights from that data are still needed by public sector. So it's a fragmented landscape. We think there are actually 3 data revolutions that are relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals. One is a measurement revolution, the opportunity to use these new data sources to generate statistical indicators faster, cheaper, with more detail. The second is a management revolution. How can we use real-time feedback from the populations who are benefiting or not benefiting from our policy interventions to adapt our strategy until we are getting results, right? This is the effect that big data has had in private sector. Whole new business models, new ways of operating, more agile, more adaptive, new ways to learn. And finally, an accountability revolution. This is a new evidence base for the effectiveness of policy that should help to empower citizens to hold governments accountable for results. So what is a data revolution? People use this term. I would say the discovery of X-rays and the innovations in medical imaging are a data revolution. I think of a data revolution as something that lets you see what was invisible before. You can see dynamics, you can see details that you could not see before. Medical imaging transformed medical practice. You could understand the causes of disease. You could understand how to treat a patient in a way that you never could before. You can see an injury. Genetics is a data revolution. We can now see the risk that a child, when they turn 15 years old, will develop a disease, and you can begin intervention before they're even born. You can see something that was invisible before. So when we talk about the power of these new data sources to change how we make decisions in public policy, this is also transformative. Right? Our old way of looking at the world was retrospective, and it was static. It's like photography. You know, you do a survey of a community every few years, or a census every 5 or 10 years. Big data is produced continuously. It's more like video. It lets you observe dynamics that you could not see before and respond much more quickly to take action. It doesn't mean that you stop doing surveys. But by bringing these two capabilities together, you have a much smarter opportunity to work. And there's a lot of data out there. Here we are looking at Santo Domingo through the lens of Twitter. Right? People are producing huge amounts of information. A lot of it is about celebrities, sports scores, what they're having for dinner. But when you filter that out, you find people talking about whether they can afford health care, reporting the symptoms of disease, talking about the fact that they can't find jobs. Right? There's a lot of new signals out there that we must begin to use. Our founding hypothesis for Global Pulse, right, it's about well-being. Right? The idea that as people use all of these digital services, they produce signals. As they search for information, as they move through cities, as they buy and sell goods online, as they share their lives publicly on social networks, they are producing information that can be used to recognize when they lose their jobs, or when they get sick, or when a policy is working better than expected. So all of this information is out there, and I think one useful metaphor is think of this as a new natural resource. It's abundant, it's increasingly ubiquitous, it's infinitely renewable. You cannot use the data up. But one of the challenges, of course, is that its benefits are not reaching those who need it most. Right? Many natural resources fall into the hands of extractive industries, unregulated, opaque extractive industries. You can see in some ways that big data is similar. Data mining, but we are being mined. It's being extracted from us. We don't know what's being extracted. We don't know how it's being used. We're pretty sure we're not benefiting from it the way we could. And the skills needed to create value from this data are very, very expensive and very rare. This is data science and analytics. So I think what we have here is an opportunity and a risk similar to what the global community confronted in the 1950s when we had seen the horror of nuclear war. And we understood that the radioactive material was incredibly dangerous. Right? Big data is similar. In its natural state, it contains our personal information, and its nature is to leak and harm and contaminate. But if we have the science to use it responsibly, if we have the engineering to contain it safely, and if we develop the frameworks, the policy frameworks to govern it and manage it from creation to disposal, then we can use it the way we do nuclear energy. But I think this is an analogous opportunity and challenge before us. We have to figure this out. We will not be able to achieve sustainable development if we do not use the real-time information that people are producing, but we must also not be doing any harm in the process. When we talk about the big data, there's a lot of big data out there. The Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland produces big data. Telescopes produce a lot of big data. But the big data that is most important for development, we think really is in the domain of the social sciences. Here we're talking about what people say and what they do. Now the first category, it's sort of open data. Think of this as open data. It doesn't fit in a spreadsheet, right? But it's available. Sometimes you have to pay for it. But this data is out there, and it's public, and the privacy concerns still exist, but they're not the most serious. The behavioral data, on the other hand, is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful to help or to harm. It's guarded very closely by companies that keep this information for business, right? And it's very difficult to anonymize. It's difficult to anonymize because the places we go, what we habitually do, as Aristotle said, the places we go, what we buy and sell, what we search for on the internet, are as unique to us as our fingerprint. Right? So even if you take names and numbers out of the data, it still can be used to identify you. About 6 years ago, as we started this project and really began looking at this work, we realized, well, the data is something in the hands of private sector. And so we began reaching out to industries around the world, to leading corporations within their industries, and saying, can we work together to find a way for you to share some of the data that powers your business, but do it in a way that protects privacy and protects your own competitiveness in the marketplace, but can still be used to serve the public good. The response from corporations was very enthusiastic. They saw this as a new kind of data-driven corporate responsibility strategy, but more than that, it was a way to mitigate business risk, because their data, they know, can reveal when the populations who buy their products and services are in trouble. They can see it when there's a financial crisis, when there's a natural disaster, they see it in the data. And they were very excited about the possibility that that information could be used to strengthen the resilience of the communities who are also their customers. So let me show you some examples of the kind of work we've been doing with these new data sources, and then we'll talk about some of the implications. Across much of the developing world, as you know, people don't always have a mobile phone account with a service provider. You buy scratch cards to buy credit for your mobile phone, prepaid services. In Uganda, where we have one of our laboratories, we have done a comparison of the consumption of mobile phone services to official statistics on household consumption and poverty. We get correlations of 0.88. Right, with the overall household consumption. Essentially, how people consume mobile services predicts how they are consuming other items such as food. In Rwanda, for example, we found an 89% correlation with consumption of food in market-dependent households. So every mobile phone operator in the world is running a system that can estimate the cash flow of vulnerable communities, and they don't even know it. They're beginning to realize it now. But this information can be aggregated to protect privacy and provide a real-time lens through which to observe how populations are affected by disasters or whether that new economic project is actually creating jobs. There are other ways to understand poverty as well. In Uganda, we've been using satellite imagery to look at the type of roofing material on structures. In the Ugandan National Census in 2012, the type of roofing material was considered a socioeconomic indicator. A thatched roof is very inexpensive. A corrugated aluminum roof, these blue structures, that's a larger economic investment. So we trained a deep learning algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, to recognize the thatched roof structures automatically and to recognize the aluminum structures. And then we take the trends in this data and compare it to survey data, and it turns out we can actually estimate poverty quite well without ever going to a single household. It's not 100% accurate, but it can give you the understanding of the direction and how quickly it's changing. We recently partnered with BBVA Bancomer, one of the largest financial institutions in Latin America, of course, based in Spain. And we looked at the impact of Hurricane Odile hitting Baja California Sur in 2014. And what we looked at was anonymized debit card transactions and ATM cash withdrawals. So what you see here is I think is very interesting. There's a white line. This represents the counterfactual. What the estimate is, what people would normally spend if there were no storm. The yellow line is the actual, and you see this big yellow vertical bar, that's when the storm hits, and then you see this drop, and then recovery. So the surface area between these two curves is an estimate of the economic impact of the storm. And it's very, very different in different parts of Baja California Sur. Some communities recover very quickly. Some are affected dramatically, some are not. And some take months and months and months, and they are still struggling. We use social media analysis, for example, in Indonesia, to estimate the prices of commodities. Here you see chicken and beef. We call this complainomics. It's people complaining about how much the price of food costs. They do this on Twitter all day long, on Facebook, and we get 91% accurate, 87% accurate estimates. People have no reason to lie on social media about what they're paying for groceries. So this is a way to generate inflation indices in real time, simply from what people are saying. We worked with UNAIDS in Brazil, looking at discrimination against people living with HIV/AIDS during the World Cup. In all of the cities where people were playing games, we could see hate speech against people living with HIV, for example. And it's different from city to city. This is a way to target your public awareness programs and understand where people need to know more about testing and counseling. In Indonesia, we have a system that is now being used by the Disaster Response Agency of the President. This is running in the President's Situation Room in Indonesia. And it's a system called Haze Gazer. As you're probably aware, in the island of Sumatra, there are many fires. Companies are burning the forest to plant palm oil, and this is causing smog, it's causing haze, which is making people sick across Indonesia, in Malaysia, Singapore. This system detects where people are reporting fires in Sumatra. It also detects where people are reporting the impact of this smog on their health and where they are specifically asking for government intervention. Another type of data we work with is data from mobile phone networks. So we partner with, for example, with Telefonica. We work with their data sets. They anonymize this data. What they do is they'll give us a data that has caller 1 and caller 2. We don't know who they are. The phone number has been transformed cryptographically using cryptography, so we don't know who these people are, but we can see over a year patterns of calling and patterns of movement. So every time you make or receive a call, the cell tower where that happened is recorded in the database. Every time you send a text message, the same information is produced. So if you aggregate this information, you can see the movement of a population in real time, within a city, between countries. You can see whether people call only locally, or do they call other cities, or they call other countries. Your call network, the social network of your calls, predicts your socioeconomic level very accurately. We've done this in Uganda, and it's been done in the United Kingdom. Over 95% accuracy. If you call people only in your village, you are poor. If you call people in the capital twice a week, you probably have some business or relatives who could send you money. If you're calling Paris, Rome, and Sydney every day, you're doing fine. We use this kind of mobile phone data, anonymized, again, to study many different things. In this case, looking at how people were displaced in Mexico after a flood. This is data from Telefonica. You see a normal night in Tabasco State, and then what happens during the flood. The idea here is to be able to detect where people are moving to and forming camps so that you can get the trucks with assistance on the road earlier to the right locations and be able to estimate, to predict how many people will be there by the time the trucks arrive. How people move also predicts how they spread diseases like dengue, malaria, Zika. We're working now with data from Colombia, working with UNICEF and Google in Colombia to try to predict the spread of Zika virus by looking at patterns of movement. This information is coming from the mobile phone networks, again, anonymized to protect privacy. In the Mediterranean, we have been using the maritime tracking information from ships to recognize rescues of refugees. When the boats change their course and begin to circle an area, that is a signature of a rescue event, and we have trained a machine learning algorithm to detect this automatically. Unfortunately, in many cases, what you see is this. The refugees send out a distress call, and the response is to violate international law and turn away. We're doing this with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. But what do you do with people who are not on the internet? Right. Here's one of the challenges. How can you create real-time information from communities that aren't on social media, that aren't using eBay and Amazon financial services? One of the areas we've been looking at is community radio. So in Uganda, for example, when you get out of the capital city, most people do not have a smartphone. There's slow internet from the mobile networks, but most people cannot use it. But they do have a social media platform, and it's FM talk radio. People call into shows every day, shows for new mothers, right? Shows for farmers and the diseases affecting their animals or their crops. There's a lot of information out there, but it's speech. So the idea is to use speech-to-text technology, dictation software, to turn these public conversations into text that we can then analyze as we would Facebook or Twitter. We have a 10-person team of speech engineers in Uganda who have been working on this for 2 years, working with 3 indigenous languages. So there are 7.5 million words spoken on Ugandan radio every day, 9 times the number of words in the complete works of Shakespeare. And the idea here is to recognize that content and be able to look for just the signals that you need. So we've now built speech recognition for not only Ugandan English, but Luganda and Acholi. These are indigenous languages for which, Apple, Google, Microsoft, they have, as far as we know, no plans to build a Siri or Google recognition capability for these languages, so we had to do it ourselves. So this is a radio in Acholi saying, the problem for us is the road going from Palaro to Palona, the surface is washed away. There's no connection between the people from these two places. We can now actually recognize conversations about problems with weather and infrastructure. And the idea here is to be able to see where people are talking about topics. So if you work for UNICEF, we can see overnight there were 20 different mentions of the word students in the country, in the Luganda language. And then you can come in the morning and listen to those segments. We're not replacing the human being. The idea is to train the machine to recognize the conversation you need to hear in the morning so that you can understand what the population is reporting. Here's one. Many people think those women who are in political leadership, they are either bad wives, they're prostitutes, they've been called names. Nobody believes you can actually get into an election and win. Right? Attitudes toward women in leadership roles and participation in public life. When you go to the hospital, they tell us, go to this clinic. Most of the doctors now own clinics, and if possible, government should prohibit doctors working in government hospitals from having clinics. A lot of medicine theft by doctors, and they take the medicine to their private clinics. In Uganda, we're seeing, for example, people reporting that the refugees are coming across the border into Bidi camp, and some people are saying the refugees are dirty, they shouldn't be allowed into the country, they're bringing diseases. Other people are saying the camps don't have services for pregnant women, we need to get them access to medical care. You can see this as it happens. Now, there are challenges here, of course. One is the data representativeness. If you're looking at this as a social scientist, as a statistician, you're asking, okay, but who is in that data set and how representative are they? The very poorest people are not the ones with access to these services, and this is true. This is absolutely true. To do this kind of work, you must first understand who is in the data. If we look at social media, for example, the question is, are we trying to produce a very precise measurement of an indicator? If you are, then Twitter, Facebook is probably not where you will look. What if you're just trying to understand a trend? You may be able to use this data more easily. How many Twitter messages saying, I think my sister has Ebola, do you need to see to respond? You need one tweet, one Facebook post to justify investigating, because there you're detecting an event. So is it an indicator, a trend, or an event? There are different ways to look at the data. The field of data science is a relatively new field, and it incorporates many different skill sets, combining the social sciences and computer science with many new areas of mathematics, increasingly relying on techniques of artificial intelligence. There are not enough data scientists in the world. Our data scientists come from fields like signal processing or particle physics. In general, they're very expensive, and it's difficult to find these people, more difficult to get them to work in public sector institutions when they can make $500,000 working in Silicon Valley. That's a typical salary. So it's a challenge. These skills need to be invested in university programs. Data access, of course, companies see no risk if they don't share the data. Right? So we have to change that by making them and their customers aware that by not sharing the data, they are creating risk. So we partner with many different companies. You can see some examples here. With BBVA and Telefonica, we have access to financial transactions and mobile phone records from across the region, potentially, through this partnership. We have a global partnership with Twitter that gives us access to 500 million messages every day, public messages coming out of that network. With the Universal Postal Union, we have access to the anonymized records of every package and letter crossing international borders through the national postal systems of 198 countries. It's 14 million records a day for 6 years now. And it turns out you can estimate gross domestic product, carbon footprint, literacy rates by looking at different indicators, different variables within this data set. And then there's privacy. Here we have a little pellet of plutonium from a reactor. Back to our radioactive metaphor. This is a challenge because it's very hard to anonymize these data sets. When you work with this data, you must acknowledge that there will always be some privacy risk. Maybe that's okay, but it depends on what you're doing with the data. And your entire society needs to have an understanding of this and to agree with the balance of risk. Another area where we spend a lot of time working is in data policy and ethics. We have a data privacy advisory group who help us develop the tools we use and the policies and help guide us in this very difficult space. So misusing data can cause a lot of harm. I know Facebook has a very high penetration in Dominican Republic. So you take data from Facebook and you take away the name, you take away the address, phone number. Okay, so it's anonymized. No, it's not. What you like on Facebook predicts your IQ. It predicts your sexual orientation. It predicts how much money you earn. It predicts whether your parents are divorced, whether or not you smoke or drink, your religion, your level of education, just from patterns of how you use Facebook. The challenge there is that if you're going to have some privacy risk, you're going to have to understand what the utility of the data is. So imagine we have a disease outbreak, and we're trying to understand, where do we quarantine? How much risk is the population facing now? We know we can use data from mobile phones to see how people move, and the question is, have they already spread the disease? If you use very precise location information, you have more privacy risk. But you also can see the disease is probably isolated, right? You aggregate it to protect privacy. Now we have a 1 in 150 chance of re-identifying someone, but now we only know this area may have touched a road. Maybe quarantine won't work. You get the idea, right? There's a relationship between utility for public good and the risk of being re-identified in these data sets. When we operate, we have principles for responsible use of data that have been developed for us. We've developed over the years with our advisory group. Recently, a version of these principles has been adopted by the UN Development System worldwide. So this is 33 UN agencies. 2 weeks ago, officially adopted this framework, which we helped to author, for how they will be using big data for sustainable development. We're also exploring more catalytic and leveraged approaches to innovation with big data. On the 9th of March, we launched our Data for Climate Action Challenge. Getting to Paris and the Paris Agreement required really good data about the climate, evidence that it's changing. Not everyone still believes this, apparently, but on the other hand, understanding whether our efforts to take action on climate change are working requires really good data about ourselves. Right? Imagine if we could see in real time all over the world where people are in shifting from incandescent lighting to LED or fluorescent lighting. how much of the furniture that's being sold is made from rainforest mahogany, how much is from bamboo and sustainable sources. Right? That's about human behavior. That's what big data can do. Right? So the idea was to get companies around the world to make these data sets available to research teams who will compete to develop solutions for adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. And we're bringing many different types of data here to these researchers for the first time. Data on the weather, public conversations, the use of mobile phones, financial information, retail data, and transportation data. And you can see some of the companies that are participating. Google Waze, Planet Labs, Nielsen is providing information on retail data sets to these research teams. And just to conclude, we're very interested in what might be possible regionally. In the 7 years that Global Pulse has been operating, we've spent a lot of time looking at individual types of big data. Can we use social media? Can we use mobile phone data? Can we use banking data? But for the first time in Latin America now, we have new partnerships. And partnerships where we have the same data sets overlapping together. One of the challenges that the global community is facing as the world changes is to understand if our policies are making us more resilient. What does that word mean? In the UN, it turns out we have 54 definitions of resilience, 76 definitions of vulnerability. Right? So we hope that we can change this paradigm a little bit. If you remember your high school biology, there's a concept of homeostasis, right? This is the ability or tendency of a cell or organism to maintain internal equilibrium by adjusting its physiology to conditions optimal for survival. That means you can maintain your pH, your salinity, your temperature, even if the outside changes, right? Our bodies do this. Every cell in our body does this individually. Communities do this. Right? When there's a natural disaster, when there's a change in commodity prices, we believe that big data is going to allow us to observe changes in subjective well-being and objective function in real time to understand who's impacted and how long it's taking to recover. We could see this from BBVA with the hurricane in Baja California Sur. So we think there's a real opportunity here to use this information to understand the behavior of communities quickly enough to improve outcomes for the most vulnerable populations. And you can see some of these partnerships. If we look across Latin America and the Caribbean now, we potentially, for the same countries, can get access to social media, calling records, financial transactions, of course, satellite imagery, and then all of the traditional data sets. There's an opportunity here to create a truly 21st century behaviorally focused approach to policy development. So, in conclusion, one of the exciting and terrifying aspects of the world we now live in is that we're producing all of this data in a way where almost everything we do, theoretically, can generate data and can be knowable by a person or a machine. Imagine that the year is 2030 and 5 billion people are wearing a device that is free, and it tracks everywhere you go, everything you say, everything you do, what you buy and sell, how you feel, how you think, and the functioning of every organ in your body. Is that an opportunity to create an enlightened society of the future? Or is this the raw material of every dystopian nightmare we can imagine? Probably both. How do we make this safe? What policy frameworks, what technology and mathematical innovations do we need? What new ethics do we need as a society and change in our culture to make sure that some kinds of data are guaranteed to be used for the public good when they can be? Some may never be used by anyone, and some perhaps can only be accessed by machines. What we're talking about here with big data is the socioeconomic equivalent of meteorology. Right? Imagine if we could see in real time the way we can see temperature, air pressure, and the speed of the wind. Imagine if we could see for any community in the world what's happening in poverty, in hunger, and disease, and feed that information into predictive models that let us detect emerging risks and proactively respond to prevent harm. That's the opportunity, but we have to address the risks that we can see up front. Muchas gracias.